As the West wages economic war against Russia, Moscow's main stock exchange has been closed for 2 weeks, and the ruble has fallen some 30% against the dollar in that time. One big problem for Putin is that there aren't a lot of countries that can save Russia from financial failure. Russia's friends like Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua certainly don't have the cash to prop up Putin. But many people are wondering whether China will or can come to Russia's rescue. To answer that, New York Times columnist Paul Krugman joins me. Paul, let me first ask you, Putin thought he had built a kind of sanctions-proof economy. He had built up that big war chest of $600-odd billion in foreign exchange reserves. Was the freezing of those foreign exchange reserves the kind of central reason why Russia seems to be so badly battered by these sanctions?
Well, it's part of it. I mean, I think that Putin had no idea what kinds of sanctions he was going to be facing. He thought maybe it would be a few exports would be restricted, not that Russia would be shut out completely from the world financial system, which is pretty much what's happened. And when you do that, the fact that you have reserves, which are mostly just deposits in banks overseas, doesn't do you a bit of good. They're all frozen. And the rest of the reserves is largely gold bars sitting in Russia, which are also actually not really useful for global commerce. So I think Putin just had a completely false idea of what kind of economic regime he was going to face.
But what about the oil and gas revenues? Those seem to continue uninterrupted. And is that a big loophole in the sanctions regime?
It's not clear that it matters. First of all, it's not even clear exactly that Russia can even quite get at the cash that's coming in. I mean, you have to ask, how are those imports being paid for? How are people paying for Russian oil? If they're putting money into a Russian bank account, well, Russia doesn't have access to that bank account. And also, I think the biggest problem for Putin is really not export revenue. It's actually the ability to import, which is not at all the same thing. And it's becoming extremely hard for Russia to access the stuff it buys, which is crucial to its economy.
So that gets us to China. Can China be the solution? Can China buy Russian oil and then give Russia, a series of essentially a kind of barter, a renminbi that can be used to buy stuff in China? And after all, China is a huge economy.
Okay, there are a couple of problems with that. One is, in terms of China buying Russian oil, you need to think a little bit about the physical side of stuff. That's one of the things we've learned in this whole supply chain crisis era. China and Russia may share a border, but that border is extremely remote from everything that matters. The Russian economy is west of the Urals. The Chinese economy is mostly along the coast. And there's an immense distance between them. Oil is normally shipped by pipelines to ports where it's loaded onto supertankers. There's no sea route from Russia, or not a usable one from Russia to China. There's no pipeline crossing the entire expanse of Siberia. You can put it into tank cars and put it on railroads, but there's only a handful of rail lines, and it's 3,500 miles from Moscow to Beijing. So just logistically, trying to make China the market for Russia's oil doesn't work very well. And on the other side, on the import side, China is an industrial powerhouse, but it's a middle-income country that doesn't produce the full range of stuff. It doesn't produce the high-end semiconductor chips that Russia needs. It can't supply the parts for Western airplanes, which is mostly what Russia flies, even on domestic flights. So China is much less of a useful escape valve for Russia than you might imagine.
Is there a danger that this kind of weaponized use of the dollar, particularly when you're up against China and Russia, and some other countries like India that continue to buy everything from Russia, that it will lead to some kind of alternative regime to the dollar, to SWIFT? Could it accelerate that transition?
Well, what we've learned, and this is from lots of stuff that comes from long before this crisis, is that replacing the dollar as the global key currency is a lot harder than people seem to imagine. It's not something you can do by decree. And what you need to have a global currency is you need, first of all, it has to be in widespread use in world trade to begin with. It has to be backed by a significant economy. It has to be backed by a deep, highly liquid bond market. So nothing that's happened so far would seriously threaten the dollar's hegemony.
So bottom line, it sounds like you're saying Putin is going to pay a very high price and the Russian economy is essentially collapsing.
Yeah, I'm looking at estimates that from banks that doing this, they're talking about 10 to 15% decline in real GDP, and they look low to me. This looks to me like it's a really catastrophic event for Russia.
Ironically, those are the kind of declines you saw in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is in some ways what brought Vladimir Putin to power.
Yep. He really just seems to have had absolutely no idea what he was getting himself into.
Paul Krugman, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
And we will be back.